Hello and welcome to the last video of the series. This is Nikhil, and in this video we are going to talk about mixing and some basic audio effects. So what is mixing? Mixing is making sure that the individual tracks in your song or the musical section sound good with each other. And we can achieve this in two stages. The first stage is right when you're composing. Because if you think about it, when you put together, let's say, a melody section with a harmony or bass section, you're going to make sure that the sounds and the note choices do not clash or overlap and become congested. You're trying to achieve clarity in your mix from the get-go. And the other part is working with audio effects to enhance the different sections of your song so that they stand out together as a mix. So let's start by going through our first audio effect, the equalizer. So if you look at the Ableton screen, I have a project loaded. This is the same project I had in my last class. So let me play this back for you. Alright, so what we are going to do is, we are going to use an equalizer. And I can find my equalizer here in the categories. If you look down below, here we have the audio effects. And within the audio effects, if you come down to EQ and filters, I have a bunch of EQs. So an EQ is short for equalizer. So for today's lesson, I'm going to use EQ8. Let me drag and drop it onto my track. So what does an equalizer do? An equalizer affects the volume of your tracks in a frequency dependent manner. So let me show you what I mean. Within the equalizer, you can see this sort of a graphical representation, and when I double click this, I can enlarge it. So when I play my music, you can see certain waves go up and down. So this is basically a graph of frequencies of sound in the x-axis against their relative volumes. And I can control the volume at any part of my frequency spectrum by simply clicking on any of these points and dragging them down or up. One thing to note here is, as we go from the left side to the right side, the frequencies increase, or I could simply say the pitches increase. So let's start by understanding what do each of these points do. So as you can see, EQ8 has 8 EQ points, and they're denoted by the numbers. Some of them are off. I can switch them off and switch them on with these buttons. And now let us focus on an individual EQ point. So right here, I have my first EQ point. And over here, you can notice that when I drag this point up and down, a shape is created. Now this is called as a filter shape. And I can change my shapes through this menu. So what exactly is this shape doing? So depending on the shape, what is under the curve is allowed to pass through. The frequencies under the curve are allowed to pass through, and the frequencies which are outside of the curve are cut out. So let me demonstrate. I can easily move my shape by moving the frequency point towards the right. So check this out. This is my frequency point. Notice how we start losing out the low frequencies as I move further towards the right. So essentially what is happening is, the filter shape is deciding to omit the lower frequencies and allow the higher frequencies. So this shape is called as a high pass filter. Or I could also call it as a low cut filter. And if I change the shape to this, now the reverse is happening. What you're hearing is the low frequencies, and what is getting omitted out is the higher frequencies. Now another important shape to keep in mind is the bell shape. So what the bell shape allows me to do is create a sort of a bell around the frequency of the EQ point and boost or cut a frequency to a certain depth using this gain function. And an interesting feature about this filter type is that I can use it along with the audition feature, which is this button right over here. And when I click and drag, I don't hear anything else except the frequencies right under my EQ point. And this way I can decide if I like certain frequencies or if I don't like certain frequencies in my sound, I can easily cut them off. So let's say that I don't like this frequency right over here. So I can let go and I can pull down my gain. Now another parameter of my EQ is the Q factor. So by increasing or decreasing the Q, I can narrow my focus around the cutoff filter point or make it wider. In this case, I would want it to be a little narrow. Like I said before, EQ can also be used to separate the clashing frequencies between the different sections. So what I'm going to do is, I have my second point over here. I'm going to come into my filter types. I'm going to select a high pass filter. And while I listen to my bass, I'm going to move this cutoff frequency ahead so that I get a bulk of the low frequencies from my harmony out of the way of my bass. So this is just an example of how you can begin mixing with EQs. So the next thing we're going to talk about is managing our volume levels. So we have already gone through our volume faders in the first initial lessons. Now here, look at the master track. When I play, there are certain moments where the volume master hits into the red, which is not a good thing. This means that it is crossing over 0 dB, and this is called as clipping. Now, to avoid this, I can do what is called as gain staging and rework the balance between my levels. One way to do this is select all of my tracks by holding the first one, selecting the first one, holding down shift, selecting the last one, and that way I can control all of my track individual faders at once. Now another good thing to remember is I can use something called as utility, which I can find in audio effects, utilities and utility. I can put it on my track and here you see a gain fader. I can use this to automate my volumes across multiple sections of my song so that I can easily gain stage my volume levels throughout my song. Now let us talk about dynamics. So for this, let us listen to just a drums track. And over here, I've soloed just the bit where I have my kicks and my hi-hats. So consider that my kick is really loud and my hi-hats are really soft. Now why does this matter? Because when I play my entire musical section, say with a lot of different instruments, it's possible that my hi-hats might just fall a little short in volume. So what will happen is, when we play the song, we might not be able to hear the hi-hats clearly. And what we'll naturally do is try to increase the volume of our drums. But that will lead to the entire drum kit being loud and maybe overpowering the rest of the song. So what we want to do is control the volume of the hi-hats without actually affecting the overall volume of our drums. So this is where we get into dynamics. So a dynamic range is the difference between my louder moment and softer moment in my music. What I want to do here is actually reduce my dynamic range and not reduce or increase my volume. And the tool to do this is called as the compressor. Let us go ahead and load the compressor on our drums track. So I can find the compressor under audio effects, dynamics, and the compressor. So I have it on the drums track, and for the sake of convenience, I'm going to switch it to this view. Basically, the compressor has 3 different views, which basically show similar things. So when I play my music, you can see the input level over here in the left column and the output level over here in the right side column. And this fader over here, which looks like a volume fader, is called as the threshold. Now what happens in a compressor is, When the signal rises above the threshold, the compressor applies what is known as the gain reduction. So check this out. So you can see over here in this column, we are seeing some gain reduction, which is basically the compressor clamping down on the signal, reducing the signal level every time the signal crosses the threshold. I can control this by controlling the ratio. So what the ratio does is, when it is 1:1, it does not really affect the signal. The input and output are in similar proportions. But as I increase the ratio, you can notice the gain reduction increasing. What this means is the signal is getting reduced by more and more proportions every time it is crossing the threshold. So what this indirectly does is, it gives me extra headroom, or it basically reduces my dynamic range. Now headroom is the difference between the peak level of my signal to 0 dB. So in effect, I can increase my output. And that way, I can virtually have the kick where it already was, but I can increase the level of the softer portions, in this case my hi-hats. Over here, I have something called as the knee, which basically decides how quickly the ratio changes once the signal crosses the threshold. Because as you can see from this graphical representation, up until the threshold, the signal is 1:1, and immediately the signal gets turned to 3:1 or 4:1 or whatever we set on the compressor. When I increase the knee, it becomes a little more curvier, which implies that the ratio is applied gradually over a stretch of volume. And when my knee is 0 dB, you see it being more pointier, which means the ratio is applied abruptly. So you can experiment with these values to get different kinds of behavior out of the compressor. Now let us listen to that with the entire song. My overall level has gone up, so I'm just going to select all of my tracks, lower the gain. So the next thing that we need to look at is time-based effects. And before that, let us talk about space. Now imagine you're standing in your room and your friend is talking to you, or your friend is playing guitar. Now you're going to listen to the sound of the guitar directly coming from the guitar, the vibrations hitting your eardrums. You're also going to hear that sound indirectly because there are walls and ceilings and floor around you. So the sound is going to disperse, bounce off the walls, bounce off the floors, and then hit back at you. Sometimes it can just bounce off once and hit you. This is known as early reflections. And sometimes it can just keep bouncing and then hit you ultimately. And this is called as late reflections. So the direct sounds happen quickly, or the most fastest, and then comes the set of early reflections which take a little bit of time, usually in milliseconds, and then we have the late reflections which can even go into seconds depending on how your space is. Let us look at adding some space into our music, and for this we need to use an audio effect called as reverb, and this is the effect which exactly does that, add space. So over here in my audio effects, I can come into reverb and resonance, select reverb. I'm going to use reverb on my melody track. So there we have it. This is the reverb effect. Let's listen to how it sounds right off the bat. I'm going to switch the reverb unit on and off for you. You can notice how the sound is immediately in your face the moment I remove reverb, and when I have it, feels like you're floating along with the melody. What we spoke about, the direct sound and the indirect sounds or the reflections, can be controlled by using the dry and wet knobs. So when I turn it 100% wet, what you're hearing is just the room. It's as if the guitar is not, or the instrument is not directly hitting at you, it's only the reflections coming at you. Now let us talk about decay time. Imagine you're singing in a big hall, and like when you sing, you can feel that the sound takes a little extra time to fully decay out. But if you're in a really small room, or let's say your bedroom, and you're singing, you don't really hear that. Sound fades out more quickly. Now this aspect relates to the decay time in the reverb. Let me show you. So I'm going to make a new clip and I'm going to put two spaced out notes, and let me just play these two notes. And I'm going to gradually increase my decay time and see what happens. You suddenly feel that instrument is playing in a big hall as opposed to this. So decay time is the amount of time sound takes to practically fade out once the source signal has been removed. Now let us look at the input processing section. Over here, it actually looks like a really tiny EQ, and it is. So I can switch on the low cut filter and the high cut filter to create this sort of a bell shape. And now this is the filter at the input stage. The reason why this exists is because usually when we use the reverb unit and we have really long decay times, if you're sending out too low frequencies or too high frequencies, chances are that it may not usually sound good. So this input processing actually helps you cut out those frequencies before it enters the reverb machine. And it's a great way to give some character to how the sound sounds in that space. Try putting reverb in a lot of different types of sounds and explore different kinds of sonic aesthetics that you can get out of it. Let us talk about the delay effect. Now, delay is one of the most widely used effects, and it is really popular across different styles of music. We'll jump right into it. So over here in my audio effects, you can see the delay and loop category, and within that I have the delay. So I'm going to load my delay onto the melody track. Let me just delete this reverb for the moment. And let's just listen to what happens when I leave the delay on and when I cut it out. So what the delay effect is doing is it is repeating the individual sounds, and because I have a melody going on, that repetition is rhythmically cascading into a harmony. I can change the delay times between my left and right channel by unlinking them and setting different times. So you sort of get a variation in that pattern. Down over here we have the feedback control. When I turn the feedback control all the way to 0, I'm only going to hear one repetition. So let me play this clip. And notice that when I increase my feedback, you're going to hear more repetitions. So what is happening here is the output of the delay is fed back into the input. So what this means is that whatever percentage I give, that amount of volume coming out of the delay is sent back into the input. And the more percentage I give, the more repetitions I get. I'm going to leave that here. The next thing we are going to talk about is sends and returns. Imagine the situation where you wanted to send multiple tracks to a same effect. Let's take the example of space. Now I want multiple tracks like harmony, bass, melody, and all my drums, all of these tracks to be put into the same space, meaning that I need to have a reverb unit in all of these tracks, which would simply be too much effort and also consume too much of my CPU power. But instead of that, I can use sends and returns and simplify the process. So as you can see on the right hand side, we have what we call as our return channels. Ableton by default gives two return channels. One for reverb, which has the reverb effect. Second one for the delay, which has the delay effect. So the way this works is I can send the audio from my individual tracks through these knobs. Let me solo this. So what's happening is the audio from this is parallelly being sent to the A return track, which has the reverb, and then it is returned to the master. Similarly, I can open up my B send and send some of the signal to the delay track. Let me just switch off the delay which is already in the track. I can send audio from multiple tracks into the same return. So as you can see, we can have a lot of fun with audio effects, and clearly audio effects is not just meant for mixing. We can use them creatively and directly affect the way we compose music. Now let us take a look at how we can export our music out of Ableton as an audio file. And to do this, I need to have my music in the arrangement view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a project which I already have where there's some music in the arrangement view. I'm going to say no. So here we have some music in the arrangement view. I think this is from the module 2. So the way to do this is, first select the area of your arrangement which you want to be as part of the audio file. So I think this is the starting point, or maybe this, let's play and check. Yeah, so I'm starting right from the beginning and going all the way to okay, I'm ending over here. So what I'm going to do is simply select this area. So I have the start point and the end point covered within the selected area. I'm going to make a loop, and now I'm going to select this loop so my entire length is selected. Now I'm going to hit Ctrl, Shift and R to open the export audio menu. For Mac it would be Command Shift R. Now within this, as you can see, the render track is the master track where everything is accumulating. That's what we want. And what we need to pay attention to is the sample rate. 48,000 is a good sample rate. And bit depth, you could either go with 16 or 24, you won't go wrong with either. And I have to look at the file type. So ideally you would want a WAV file, which is the purest form of audio you can get out of Ableton. And I'm going to hit export. When I do that, it will give me an option to decide what is the file name and where I want to place the file. So I'm going to call this as lesson 4 export. And I'm going to save this. So it's doing its thing to save the file. You got to wait for a little while. And almost. And yes, it is done. So we now have the audio file. As I spoke, it did some more background work. But yeah, we have it. So I can go to the location. I think it was the bounce folder. So let's quickly go there. Go into my bounces folder. And here I have the lesson 4 export. So as we can see here, I have the WAV file, but I also have an MP3 file. Now this is because when I set the preferences for my export, the MP3 option was already on. Ideally, we wouldn't recommend the MP3 because it is a compressed format, whereas WAV is an uncompressed, or in other words, you can call it as a pure format. Well, this marks the end of our basics of Ableton Live lessons. If you like the way I teach, be sure to check out my live online masterclass on music production. And while you're on the platform, be sure to check out some other courses as well. There are a lot of interesting trainers, artists and producers on the platform. It's a whole community. Be sure to engage with it. Share your questions and share your music with us. We'd like to know what you've been working on. And thank you for watching. Happy learning and peak creativity.